All right. Well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. And I'll go ahead and start as per usual with the news of the week. So, excuse me, this week, one of the things that's happening in the first quarter of this year is a lot of the states are rushing to pass legislation regarding solar and net metering specifically. These can be regulations or they could be bills that are passed in the legislature. Actually, in the first quarter, in the last 3 months, there were 173 of these different regulations passed statewide. And sort of a spoiler alert, these things were not beneficial to the end user, to the customer. These things were pushed through by the utilities. Of this 173, 59 of them were modifying net metering from the traditional system that we're aware or that we've come to know and love, which is your meter rolls backwards. Effectively, you're getting paid retail for anything you send back. Well, all of these primarily are being shifted to avoided cost. So essentially, whatever the wholesale rate that the utility is paying for energy generated from another source, they're going to pay you. So a lot of this net metering has gone down significantly, probably about a quarter of retail. 45 of these regulations dealt with expanding community solar. So community solar is essentially when you're not putting the solar array on your own roof, but you're buying into a larger array. And they're then allocating the production from your ownership, your portion of the ownership, to your bill. Many of these are trying to expand community solar to incorporate low-income and moderate-income housing. So I think we would consider those to be good things. Then about 34 of them are adding minimum charges or fixed access charges to your electric bill. So in the past, you could whittle your bill down to zero. Now, what the utilities are striving for, and I think this is something we need to just anticipate, there's going to be a fixed access fee to the grid. Probably you cannot get rid of that. It's going to be a minimum bill. And then they're going to be paying you wholesale for whatever you generate back as opposed to retail, which so we're seeing the phasing out of a lot of the benefits of net metering. So we just need to deal with that. So what ends up happening is you typically then look at putting in battery systems so that you're not feeding back to the grid. You're using it. Self-consumption is what they call it, where you store it, use it on the day that you stored it. No sense selling wholesale and buying retail. You may as well hold on to it. And then you can also use those batteries to deal with things like time of use pricing. And if it's a commercial property, then the demand charges. So a lot of reasons now to shift over to solar plus storage. And we're seeing that reflected in the bids that are out there. The Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives have decided that solar and renewable energy is bad, and they're trying to essentially overturn any of the incentives that have been pushed through by the Biden administration. The first one that they're targeting is in June of last year. The Biden administration put a hold on tariffs and penalties associated with those tariffs from the 4 countries, Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And if you remember, the controversy there was that, there was a tariff on Chinese produced panels. China simply moved production to those 4 countries. Those 4 countries then became about 80% of all of the panels that are consumed in the United States came from those 4 countries. There was a lawsuit. They said, we think they're just trying to avoid paying the Chinese tariffs. And yeah, they were. And so then there was essentially the supply chain just came to a halt. Biden said, okay, that's not acceptable. We've got to have some panels. Yeah, it's not a good situation, but let's put a 2-year moratorium. And then by putting the Inflation Reduction Act, they've been moving significant amount of production to the United States through the incentive program there. So the general consensus was by the end of this 2-year moratorium, it's not going to be an issue anymore because most of the production will be domestic. But the House Republicans are going, well, we don't even want that to happen. We just want, I mean, whatever. I don't know their logic. And then they've also decided to incorporate the Inflation Reduction Act, all of the provisions, the incentives there. They want rid of those, and that's now part of the budget, not the budget battle, but the debt ceiling battle, where they're trying to hold the administration hostage to say, we're not going to raise the debt ceiling unless you do all of these things. Well, one of those things they want to do is get rid of all of the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. So we'll see how that works out. So same old nonsense from Washington. Anyway, what we're seeing also as a result of supply chain as well, but also just the demand is there, power purchase agreement prices continue to rise. In the first quarter of this year, there was a combined rise of renewable energy prices, 6.6%. That represented an 8.5% increase in solar and 4.9% increase in wind. So what a power purchase agreement is large developers will develop a solar array, and then they sell these the production to either a company like Amazon or Walmart or whoever, Intel, or to a utility company. They do that through a power purchase agreement, and those prices are rising. In fact, over the last 3 years, really from the start of COVID, we've seen power purchase agreement prices, the blended rate between wind and solar, go up from about $27 per megawatt hour, which is effectively about 2.7 cents per kilowatt hour. That's the wholesale rate. That's increased to about 5.2 cents per kilowatt hour, or $52 per megawatt hour. That's a 92% increase in the last 3 years. A lot of this is due to COVID issues, you know, the workforce disruption there, supply chain issues, decommissioning of a lot of the fossil fuel plants. So basically they're shutting down these plants, but they're not able to build fast enough, the replacement, and solar panel tariffs to China, that increases prices. And it's really just a sense of supply does not meet demand. So we're seeing some pretty dramatic price increases. And a new product out there on the market, this company, HailSense 360, has announced this new product. It's primarily for large systems, but it will track and predict hailstorms. So they're claiming they can even project this out 90 minutes in advance of a hailstorm event. And because a lot of these utilities are on tracking systems, the utility system can then shift the panels to avoid a lot of damage. In fact, they're saying that by having this warning and shifting the angle of the arrays, survivability of a large major hailstorm goes from about 82% to about 99%. And because of climate change, especially in West Texas, these hailstorm events have become more and more frequent and more dramatic. The hail has been getting a lot bigger. In fact, there was a storm in 2019 at the Midway Solar Project in West Texas, where about 400,000 out of the 685,000 panels in that array were damaged due to one single hailstorm. The insurance estimate on that was about $70 million in damage. So this is a nice device. It's increasingly important. And also it will track and let the utilities know what kind of damage they did sustain and probably provide data logging for their insurance claims, things like that. So that's the news from the solar industry for this week. Anybody have anything else to add there, or any comments on that? Give you just a second. You're probably muted, so if you have anything.
Well, Jay, I have a question here about the what you're talking about, the net metering. So basically, we're all going to start paying the flat, like you and I are paying co-ops, the flat, whatever it is. Does that happen with the regular utilities too, the investor-owned utilities?
Yes, yes. Now they have to go through the Public Utilities Commission to get that raised. And those are some of the regulations that are happening. And unfortunately, the utilities pretty much control the utility commissions. But we're not seeing them as dramatic. Like, for instance, the co-op that I am a member of charges like $42 a month as a fixed fee because I have solar. If I didn't have solar, they only charge $21. So quite nice. But AEP, those kind of companies are charging currently about $10, maybe $8, somewhere in that range. We'll probably see that go up. My only concern with that is that the fee should reflect the actual cost of providing service. If it costs them $10 a month to give me access to the grid, and I value the grid worth $10 a month because saves me not having to have batteries, well then, fair enough. Pay them what they're due, but don't charge me $100 just because you don't like solar.
All right. Well, thank you.
Sure thing. Any other questions on that? Let me jump into the announcements, the events that are happening here. Try and keep up on all the webinars and things like that, just to let you know. And as I mentioned, rather than I have access, I have the links. If you want to get those from me, just drop me an email, j@bluerockstation.com, or just look it up on Google, probably easier. So there is a webinar on the 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern time. All these dates are Eastern time. And this has to do with South America clean energy. So that's interesting. There's another one coming up April 27th on essentially selling solar systems to end user customers. So that's at 2 p.m. on the 27th. There's one coming up on the 24th of May, 1 p.m. This one is a cybersecurity webinar about cybersecurity for wind energy, but I assume that it also is applicable to solar as well. And then there were a couple of recent webinars that took place where they posted the videos. You can get them. Some of them you've got to log in and give them your data before they let you see it. This one was on EV charging, managing at the workplace. Quite a good video, I've heard. Oh, there was another one. I thought maybe I skipped those. I got those out of line. But there's a webinar about REAP grants, and it's from the USDA. But there have been a lot of changes in the Rural Energy for America program. REAP grants, they've increased the amount of grant available for rural businesses and agricultural businesses up to 50%. So you can get that. It's from the USDA. And there's a good Ohio Energy Conference here coming up in November. Save those dates. I've been to this a couple of times now. It's really, really quite a nice conference, November 8th and 9th. And there's the REAP grant. The REAP grant one, Rural Energy for America program. I did attend that webinar and it was very informative. A lot of changes in that program. So those were the announcements I had there. And at this point, we'll give just a slight pause here to say, do you guys have any additional items to add to the events or anything that you want to bring up before I jump into the topic of today, which is basically about the interconnection process, hooking up your solar array to the grid, and why is that process so screwed up? So that's our topic there.
Jay, do you have a podcast location for that REAP grant webinar?
If you would drop me an email, I'll pull up my connection on that, or you can just see if you can just find it through Googling USDA REAP grant webinar. But send it to me. I don't have it off the top of my, you know how these links are, they're massively long. So
sure. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, Jay.
Yeah, Nancy.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. We are planning to install solar panels, and we're in a suburb of Columbus, but we don't want to install them on our roof. we want to install them on, I don't know how to say this, but on the top of a pergola.
Yeah.
We want to install them in an area near our house, but we want to be able to walk under them to get into the shop. Any thoughts about putting up the array up high?
Oh, yeah. That's not that uncommon. We actually did one up in Upper Arlington that was essentially on like a pergola. It's good. It's nice. The only issue we ran into up in Upper Arlington had to do with setback from the property line. They wanted to make sure, it seemed to me it was like a 10-foot setback. They didn't want these things right on the property line.
Oh, that's no problem here.
Okay, you got plenty of room. So
Yeah, yeah. So what about like, we're not quite sure who to get us to help install that framework, because when we look at buying some equipment, they're all close to the ground equipment.
yeah. Well, of course, yeah, it's kind of, you're looking at two separate skill sets. One is carpentry there to create your pergola. It seems to me Ohio Power Solutions used to do pergola systems. Oops, I always thought that acronym was a little bit unfortunate, but that's one that comes to mind. But if you get somebody who's going to just install the pergola for you, just try and make them keenly aware that there's a solar array going on top of it. So you want to look at orientation. You want to make sure, you're going to have to trench from it to your house probably for the wires. If you're going to do a microinverter system, you're going to have a combiner box. That's probably going to be mounted on your wall of the house. So, there's a little bit of just coordination between the two different projects to make sure you're building this so it's solar ready. But there's no conflict there.
We just build a sturdy pergola and we're good to go.
Yeah, and depending on the kind of roof you want to put on it, if you want to put a metal roof, there are metal roof racking systems that you would use. If you're putting a shingle roof on there, there are shingle roof racking systems that you would use. So it's not an unusual situation.
We weren't going to put a roof on it. We were just going to put a framework with the solar panels. Is that okay?
Oh, you just want to use the solar panels as your roof?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that works. The only issue there, of course, is typically there's a gap between the solar panels, so it's not going to be 100% waterproof, although there are gasket systems that you can put between those panels to try and make them leak proof, but I wouldn't count on that being 100% effective.
Yeah, we've been getting rained on in that area for a long time, so we're not worried about that.
Okay.
Thank you.
There are also some solar panels out there that have a little bit of translucence to them. The gaps between the cells. So you might want to look at something like that that'll give you kind of an interesting ambiance, a little bit of sunlight coming through. So in picking the solar panels, remember you're going to probably see the underside of it, from the pergola. So why not pick something that's kind of interesting, attractive, provide some light. So that's what I would suggest as you're picking those panels.
Oh, that's really cool. But actually, we bought the solar panels from somebody used a little bit for years ago, and we've had health issues, so we haven't gotten around to installing them until hopefully this year.
Oh, okay. All right. So you're already committed. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sure thing. I see Pete. Pete, you got your hand raised there.
Yeah, two comments for Nancy. One is that when it comes to a ground mount, we generally tolerate wires and things like that would be considered a little unsightly for a pergola or an awning. So just to remind your installer that, this needs to look nice, because some of them aren't the most tidy. Then the other thing would be that if the pergola is not attached to your house, you're not subject to the module level rapid shutdown, and you may have options other than MLRS modules or microinverters. So keep that in mind, unless it is attached to your house in some way.
Yeah, and
it's
you're
not
also
attached to the house with the modular shutdown. What?
Oh, the rapid shutdown, what Pete's referring to is for occupied buildings, there has to be an electronic device attached to the panel that turns it off as soon as it loses sight, or no, that it restricts energy flow to the panel's area itself, basically, so that a firefighter cutting through a wall or something doesn't hit a live wire. So, you know, it's not an issue on a pergola. Also, the 3-foot setback requirements are not going to be an issue on a pergola if it's detached. So you could go right to the edge, which you would have to if you're doing the roof, you know, so. But you may still find that you want to use microinverters depending on the size of your system, just because it's the most economical, you know, option. You know,
we are planning on microinverters.
We are, and we'll have, you know, shut off at the combiner box, which is going to be below the array. Plus there'll be, you know, a shut off over there before it connects into the grid.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty standard system, and your combiner box there has your data, you know, your communication device within it. So depending on how far you are away from the house, you know, if your Wi-Fi will reach to it, that's another consideration to worry about.
We're going to be 3 feet away from the house.
Oh, 3 feet.
3 feet away from the top and 12 feet away from the house.
Okay. Yeah, that shouldn't be an issue. So you can pretty much, then it's just a matter of, you know, aesthetics and coordination, that kind of thing, where you want to put the equipment.
Okay, thank you.
Sure thing. Pete, did you have another question there, or is the hand still raised there?
Oh, my bad. I'll take it down.
Okay, all right. Somebody else had mentioned, I saw in the comments flash up, that there are some REAP grant examples on YouTube if you want to search on that. And Catherine, you had a question there?
What kind of grant?
Oh, REAP, Rural Energy for America program, but that's a commercial program, not residential.
Thank you.
Catherine, go ahead.
So this is unrelated to pergola mount, but more related to current news. I read recently that there's going to be a solar panel manufacturing facility going up in Pataskala. And I was wondering if anybody knows what kind of panels they're going to be manufacturing. Do you know if it's going to be thin film or?
No, I'm aware of that. It's actually going to be the largest silicon panel manufacturing facility in the country. I forget if it's Q-Cell, for some reason that strikes a bell, but it's silicon based. It's regular solar cells.
Great. And does anybody have any idea like what the timeline is on that manufacturing facility? Like, is that going to happen in 2022?
Not 2022. You got to come into 2023.
I'm sorry, in 2023. Yes, in 2023.
Again, just going by memory, it seemed to me they were targeting fourth quarter of this year. So it's pretty quick. And they were saying they're going to be hiring about 800 people to work at that facility. So it really makes Ohio the largest, far and away the largest manufacturer of solar panels outside of China. You know,
that would be amazing. And I was just wondering if it's worth it to hold out, you know, until these locally made panels are available to actually get an installation done this year. And I'm talking about for myself.
For yourself or for your customers?
Well, for myself, but I could also, advise my customers one way or the other, because a lot of them are looking for domestic, first of all. And then we also still, correct me if I'm wrong, don't know what the benefits are for residential if we use domestic products, correct? Last I remember that that was still being determined.
Yeah, there are those two issues. First off, personally, I wouldn't wait just because supply chain is so dodgy anyway. The panels that are being made at First Solar up in Toledo, they've sold out their inventory through 2028. So, you know, if you're waiting, you're going to wait a good long while there. Yeah, if there is advantage, a 10% tax credit if you use domestic product. And that would be certainly advantageous if you can wait, but it doesn't have to be Ohio made. It would just be US made. And there are a lot of plants opening up. They just keep making announcements. That's one of the reasons this whole House thing, trying to get rid of those tariffs or shut that pause down, doesn't make any sense, because we're already transitioning to a domestic market. But the 10% is for sure for commercial and utility. It's unsure whether it applies to residential installs. Still haven't heard anything on that.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else have any questions there? All right, let me jump in. And of course, feel free to jump in if you have a question, you know, as I'm talking. That's probably the easiest way to get you heard there. So what the interconnection process, and one of the reasons I bring this up is I mentioned it a few weeks ago, the delays that are occurring in interconnection, and interconnection basically getting permission from the utility to connect your system to the grid. This is the single largest impediment to the transition to renewable energy that we face as a country. You don't hear a lot about it, but it's huge. And actually, after I mentioned this, I started getting emails from folks, a little bit, you know, conspiratorial kind of emails saying, I've been in these meetings, I worked for these companies, and you wouldn't believe, you know, this is bad. I mean, they are actively trying to stop this transition. And you know, it all felt a little bit, you know, Woodward and Bernstein or whatever. And I certainly don't have the resources to check up, but it was worth bringing this up again, just as you know, it's an issue. It's a huge issue. So what is the issue? Well, if we back up to the residential area, and I'll tell you, you know, residential is where we all focus a good deal of our attention, but the industry as a whole kind of sort of goes, oh yeah, there's residential as well. You know, it's like utility scale, commercial, that's really where their attention is. That's where the big money is and the big impact to the country. But residential still is an issue. So when you're going to install a system, typically one of the very first steps is going to be go to your local utility, get permission to connect. So you need to get an interconnection agreement underway. And that's going to be the first thing. Generally, again, there's no fee for this for small systems, but it takes a good long time to do it. I've got some numbers on that. The reason for this process, you know, the stated reason, and I think the legitimate reason, is there's a concern. How is this system going to affect the grid? You know, is this thing going to have a negative impact? Is the size of it too big versus how much you're consuming? You know, little things like that. Do we need to install a bidirectional meter? I think most utilities are up to grade on that, and they probably have already done that. But if they haven't, it's something that needs to be done. So this is the process. This is step number one. I just went through it with AEP. It's an online process. They don't require a rollout to come inspect your location, but they do require that you take photos. This is where the array is going to go. This is where the meter is. This is where the system disconnect is going to go. They wanted a one-line diagram. You know, a few other things like that, a plan view of the site. How is this laying on your site? So things like that, you submit it all online. It falls into the AEP black hole, and I guess you wait for a while. And wait for a good while. One of the things that might be a surprise, and I was just advising an installer saying, should I go ahead and just get this application underway, even though you know, the customer, or couldn't I just install the system assuming I'm going to get permission? Well, there are issues that are going to crop up. For example, if the place where you're wanting to go ahead and install your system, the utility may come back and say, listen, you're going to have to pay for a replacement of the transformer at that location. Typically with residential systems, this has not been a problem here locally. In some locations where there's a lot of solar being installed, it is. But a commercial system might be a problem. Who's going to pay for that? Well, typically it's going to be the customer, you. The utility is not going to pay for it. They're going to say, I don't need to upgrade it, except that you wanted this thing. And what would be the cost of a typical transformer that's hanging up there on the pole? Well, in the $3,000 to $7,000 range. So if you're just installing a small system, you know, let's say you're going to pay $15,000 for the system, and now all of a sudden AEP wants $7,000 for a new transformer, that may be a make or break kind of situation. And it's kind of silly that they're wanting to make this last person pay for it. We'll get into that with the utility scale. So there is some movement to say, why don't we just put a equipment replacement fee on every application? You know, like everybody who applies for an interconnection has to pay $10 or $20. And then for that person who has to have the upgrade, that fee is paid for out of that fund. Perhaps a better way of dealing with it. So what is the time that's involved? Well, there was a 2015 study, and that's kind of old, but it's the nearest one. And I will say it's only gotten worse. Study found that 38 days on average from the time you apply for this interconnection agreement to the time of approval. So, you know, so if you look at a timeline of a small residential project, okay, 38 days there for approval from the utility, 2 to 4 days to install the system. You know, there's also some timeline in there getting permitting from the local government, the authorities having jurisdiction. But if we just look at this part of the utility, 38 days up front, a couple of days to install it, and then usually 12 days on average for permission to operate. That basically means you have the utility come in, look at the installation, say, yeah, that looks good. Now you're allowed to energize your system. So that's the utility is really the big bottleneck in the timeline there. Well, who controls the process? You know, who sets the rules for the process? It's typically going to be the Public Utility Commission. Again, public utility commissions are pretty much controlled by the utilities. There is zero incentive from the utility to speed up this process because basically they're allowing the competition, solar, to be installed. In my mind, it's like saying, if I want to build a store, I have to go to Walmart to get permission to build a store. So clearly some conflicts of interest here. So that's the system we have in place. And as I said, that's at the residential end. So I guess the advice to those people who do installations, or if you're wanting to do your own system, start early, right? Start early, get your application into your local utility, make sure you get all of that stuff lined up. Then you can begin the process. But for the large systems, and primarily we're talking about utility scale systems here, but even large commercial systems. One of the big problems is the financing is usually not available until the permission to interconnect has been achieved. So you're a big developer. This is a multi-million-dollar project. You can't get commitment to the financing before you get this other thing, and this other thing's going to take a while. Typically in 2022, there was a 5-year wait for approval. So you would have had to have applied in 2017 or before to actually get approval to start building your project, at which point the money frees up and all of that. Of these people that are in the waiting queue at the moment, 95% of these are renewable energy projects. So this is a thing that specifically impacts the transition to a renewable energy industry. This graph here just shows how how the queues, this is about the capacity that's required under the current goals set by the government. And we're really looking at, if today on that graph, we're at about, I don't know, let's say 200 gigawatts there, and got to get up somewhere to 900 gigawatts. So you're really looking at 4 to 5 times the amount of capacity that needs to be installed by 2035. And the thing that's going to delay that, the demand is there for sure. The will to do it is there. The incentives are in place, but can we get these things connected to the grid to make it happen? A lot of articles that are beginning to show up saying that interconnection delays and the costs associated with them are the major barrier to the renewable energy transition. The queues, the amount that's in the pipeline is huge, and it's growing. I was just stunned. There's a report by MISO. That's sort of the Midwestern or Middle America, I forget what, but that's the regional transmission authority in the middle of the country. They said in 2008, it would take them 42 years to get through the current applications. So they were, and that doesn't account for the many, many more that have come through. PJM, that's Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland. I think that's it. Yeah, that services the upper Midwest, really from New York all the way to Chicago area. Ohio is within PJM. Well, right now they've just been granted a 2-year wait, right? I mean, a 2-year wait on applications, meaning you could not even apply as a utility scale system for to get into the queue. They're so far behind. They're just saying, we're not taking any new applications for the next 2 years. And they already have 5 years, 7 years wait on the ones that are there. So that's definitely a problem. So why is this going on? So we're sitting here and we say, okay, it's a mess. It's really, really a mess. And I don't think that there has been enough thought about it. Yeah, I'm sure some people stay up all night, but this is like an Apollo moon landing kind of mess. If really global warming is the issue that we want to address, a transition to carbon neutral energy sources is a national goal. It seems to me somebody in authority should be saying, this system is so broken, we need to change the rules around it and not tinker around the edges. It has to be completely revamped. Otherwise, it's just never going to happen. So one of the issues, first in, first served, right? That's the way that they do it. First guy in the queue, that's the first one we're going to look at, and we're going to go through that process, and we're going to give the approval. Well, so what happens? Developers are saying, I don't know, it's going to be a 5-year wait before I hear back. Why don't I just speculate? I'll just pepper the whole system with applications, because I might want to do one in Missouri. I might want to do one over here. I might want to do one over there. So they're just putting in lots of applications. Only about, I think it was, only about 23% of all of the applications that go through the process are ever built. So clearly right there, 75% or so are never take place. Now, the regulators say, look at, you're cluttering up the system, you're making us do a lot of work, and look at, you're never going to build this thing. The developers are saying, hey, we wanted to build it, but when we applied, and this is a real world example I put in that bullet point, that a company paid $2.5 billion to the authority in 2017 for the interconnection. That's to pay for upgrading of the utilities equipment and the like. Finally, when it got through the process, the utility came back and said, oh, you know what? It's going to cost you $48 million in order to connect to the grid. And you've got 15 days to pay the difference between 48 million and 2.5 million, which had been the estimate at the beginning of the application process. So obviously it wasn't built. I mean, it just, how could you? So one of the issues there is that the system tends to then say, okay, for the next person in line, if the equipment has to be upgraded to accommodate you, we're going to make you pay the entire cost of that upgrade, which would be the equivalent of like a highway system saying, okay, this highway system can handle 1,000 cars, but the 1,001st car has to pay the full cost of adding a lane to the highway, because we can't handle that last car. That's a system that obviously is flawed. And so the first 1,000 people took advantage. The next one, it's just impossible. And everybody after that. So that causes a lot of delays. So what are some of the solutions that are proposed here? Is basically getting from that first in, first out mode to the first one that's ready is the first one that's served. So under that scenario, you would have a number of milestones where it's sort of a sanity check. Do you have 100% control of the site? If you don't, you're going to the back of the line. Do you have the monies in place? If you don't, you're going to the back of the line. That kind of process, so that you could say those people who are ready to build and are serious about it, we're going to serve them first. The other ones who are speculating or perhaps don't have their act together, they get pushed back through a series of these milestones. Sounds good in theory. How it works in practice, not so sure. I don't know. Okay, so then you change the upgrading cost process so that when equipment, transmission lines, things like that, transformers need to be updated, you simply put that update cost on all applications, share it across the board so that everybody's paying a little bit instead of one project pays a huge amount. So that's another proposal that's out there to try and speed up this process, make it a little more equitable. The other issue that's floating around is just a lack of transmission lines. We're seeing a complete revamping of the grid, and the grid's not ready for it. There is no national grid system. There's no coherent strategy. There are competing interests, competing jurisdictions. One regional transit authority over another, or transmission authority over another. They fight with each other. You got to get all of the different jurisdictions in line to build new transmission lines. And a big one, which they don't like to talk about much, is that the utilities often own the transmission system. And they have, again, zero incentive to allow their competition onto the playing field. For example, AEP Ohio is the largest owner and operator of transmission systems in the United States. They serve about 5.5 million customers in 11 states. So they are a utility. And if they allow for interconnection, if they allow for more transmission, then their competition has access to the marketplace. So what is their incentive to make that happen? So what are some of the solutions for this? Some of it is to build more transmission lines. So the Infrastructure Act came about last year, and they've allocated $73 billion of taxpayer money to fund these the additional building of transmission. But as I mentioned, that's hard to get accomplished. Getting one of those high transmission lines through, problematic, and it's only going to nibble away at some of the problems. Another solution is software based. Can we maximize the infrastructure that exists by making it more efficient? And there are a lot of power flow control devices, software systems that can make this operate a little bit more smoothly. But I don't see these as being, a full solution. I think ultimately we're going to have power generated where it's used. That's going to be another issue. I see a hand went up there. Bruce, did you have a comment or a question here?
Yeah, Jay. Is this the same, like if you have a utility like a water company or a municipal authority, do they struggle with the same kind of process?
Yeah, okay. I guess your sound was really soft, but I did hear that if it's a water or utility or other utilities, is the same process in play. I suspect that it maybe is. I mean, I'm just guessing, but I think not to the same extent, because we really are undergoing a massive shift in how the electric system in this country is going to be owned, managed, and utilized. So it is a transformation that I guess is akin to the transformation we saw when the Bell system was broken up, and we began to see this wholesale transition from plain old telephone to the internet, data over wire, and then of course wireless networks. All of that was a lot of growing pains through that. I don't see us getting a solution like wireless electricity. We'll be zapping birds and brain cells all day long, but it's going to be messy. It already is messy. So don't see that as a big solution.
That seems to be like the biggest customer around here now for solar is like municipal authorities.
Yeah, I think that's logical because they often have their own utility system, so the interconnection is not a big deal. So that would make some sense. That's another thing I would worry about, and I didn't find any information about it when I looked in there. But the analogy I said when you have to apply to Walmart to build a store, so Target applies to Walmart, and Walmart says, "Oh, it's going to be 7 years before we can let you know anything about it." But if Walmart wants to expand, I'll bet you the approval happens very quickly, because they're the ones giving themselves approval. So I wonder if AEP wants to put in a solar array, do they really have a 7-year wait, or does it just happen, tomorrow? That would be interesting to know.
That's one of the things I find interesting with like brownfields, where they possibly were a large consumer of electricity, and now the factory's gone, and then you have this substation sitting right beside this brownfield.
Yeah, I think that's something that developers do look at. What is the existing infrastructure, and how can I tap into that? So old power plants, coal power plants that are abandoned, that seems a beautiful site for a solar array. Obviously, it's already got all of the equipment in place to handle the transmission of large amounts of energy. So, Bill, you had a question there?
Yeah, I listened to a podcast by Jewel Energy. It was on the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, ILSR's website. And he gave some very compelling reasons for keeping his system sizes below 1 megawatt. Mm-hmm. Once you go above the 1 megawatt level, you get into a whole different range of transmission requirements, a larger upscaled transmission. And he talked about the fact that if you keep your system under 1 megawatt, which again, as Bruce was talking about, it matches many municipal utility systems or in blocks of one. And so it made it really possible for people to get in easier without transmission upgrades. And it was a very good discussion. Again, there's a whole series of podcasts on ILSR. Very worth listening to.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, one of the issues that I did identify was that utilities don't share this information. When you go through the interconnection process, if the utilities were more transparent about where is their capacity, what will be areas that will be problematic, that information is not widely available. The whole process is pretty opaque. So we need a lot more transparency in the process of interconnection. I mentioned earlier on the residential level, but certainly on the utility scale level, there is zero incentives to the utility for cleaning up this problem. And ultimately it comes down to government oversight. And government oversight is largely relegated to the Public Utilities Commissions, which are essentially run by the utilities. You know, they'll claim they're not, but they really are. And that's why you see issues, things happening like in California that don't seem to make sense on the surface, where the governor's office, the legislature, they all say, we want really widely available incentive programs for solar. And then the Public Utilities Commission in California guts all of the solar incentives that have been out there. So it's like, okay, we're fighting each other bureaucratically, but that's because the Utility Commission represents primarily the utilities. They're the folks they know, they're the people who know the system. The lawyers take everybody out to lunch. You know, it's nothing nefarious necessarily. It's just that, you know, people become comfortable with folks over the years, and these are the folks who know how to play the system. So that's a big issue. So how do we deal with an effective government oversight? And I just don't see this thing getting substantially better unless somebody comes in with an Apollo moon landing kind of perspective and says, we've just got to, I mean, this is the goal. It's got to happen. We're going to completely change this system, and that is going to make it so. But with the current political situation, where one party has decided that the transition to renewables is something that they can score political points on, you're not going to see that kind of unification governmentally to make this happen. So I'm afraid we haven't solved the problem. So any other comments here on that particular issue, or anything else out there in the universe?
I had one relating to your comment a few minutes ago that you see this kind of ultimately heading towards individual power production. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And like in rural electrification, that made a lot of sense with stringing up all the lines and maintaining all that and the transformers. But at some point, it might be better to take that stuff down and have the utility actually be an off-grid type independent system contract. Do you know of any instances where that's actually happened, to where, say, a rural co-op has decided we'll just go with autonomous power at each place and just took down the lines and did off-grid systems and, you know, maintain those systems as a company, perhaps leasing them to the property owners?
Yeah, I don't know that. I think there's some practical reasons why that approach wouldn't work. I guess in answer to your question, I haven't seen that happening. Electrical systems are much more stable the bigger they are. So there is a tendency, this is one reason Texas gets themselves in trouble, is they don't want to be connected to the rest of the country effectively. So if there is a problem locally, it's local. But what we're beginning to see, and I think this is a trend that's going to address that, exactly what you brought up there, Jerry, is that microgrids. So I can see large institutions like universities, schools, large companies, military, where they create their own generating capacity and their own grid, and then they just sort of tie into the larger grid as an over-under kind of thing, where if they're a little bit short, they pull from the grid. If they have a little bit more, they feed to the grid. But then they're essentially self-contained as a unit. You can do that on a household basis as well. And we're seeing that by putting storage in, and you're connected to the grid, but you're also autonomous. But I think we're going to see that scaling up bigger and bigger and bigger. Maybe we'll see citywide systems, municipal systems that have their own capacity. So you begin to localize it. Under those situations, transmission lines don't come into play because the power is being generated close to where it's being consumed. But there still is an advantage to being connected to the wider grid, just because it gives system stability. So I think that's the long-term solution, but how we get there from here, that's going to be the big challenge.
Those are very good reasons for believing that. And I think the system stability is critical. But in many states, if you get beyond a point where you are exporting more power than you're using, you become a utility yourself, and you then become regulated by the Corporation Commission for that state.
Yeah. Yeah, and that of course is matter of, as you say, regulation, which it's not a physical limitation, it's just a under our current system. And it can be problematic even on wider scales, where we've seen when you start putting in large amounts of renewables. Texas ran into it a couple of times where they were over generating versus demand, and had to actually pay other utilities to take their power because it's got to go somewhere. And so there was no storage kind of system there. The alternative would be to curtail your generating systems, which if you can't do it quick enough, that can be problematic. Yep. Any other comments? Any other questions? We're running right up on the hour there. So anyway, I appreciate everybody's attendance, and I guess we'll see you guys next week. All right. Take care.
Thank you, Jay.
Sure thing. Bye-bye.
Thank you.